Okay, everybody, welcome to the 2024 virtual meeting of the California Oak Mortality Task Force. We're very happy to have you all together to listen to this year's developments in the world of Phytophthora ramorum and sudden oak death. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded for those who can't join us live. I'm Janice Alexander from the University of California Cooperative Extension in Marin County. I'm one of your hosts for today. Joining me as moderator is Chris Lee of CAL FIRE and the chair of the task force. And then helping with tech in the background is Bonnie Nielsen, also from UCCE Marin. We have a number of great speakers and topics this afternoon. As each speaker gives their presentation, you're invited to submit comments and questions in the chat. I will assist in getting those questions over to Chris and the speakers so they're able to address them at the end of each talk. And we'll try to cover any remaining questions at the very end if we have any time. So those are that's the overview. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris to kick us off.
All right. Thank you so much, Janice. And thanks to everybody for being here to see and hear updates on Phytophthora ramorum and sudden oak death, and also sudden larch death, as you'll see, for 2024. Let's get started with Kristen Fox. Kristen, we appreciate your being with us today very much. Kristen is the USDA APHIS Acting National P. ramorum Operations Manager for APHIS PPQ. And Kristen will update us today on P. ramorum in U.S. nurseries and APHIS P. ramorum regulations. So take it away, Kristen.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. It's giving me too many screen options here. I think it's this one. Share. Hopefully that works. I'm used to Teams. Is that the correct screen? Okay, perfect. All right. So I'm Kristen Fox, and I am the Acting National Operations Manager for the USDA Phytophthora ramorum program. And I'm going to quickly give you an update of findings in the U.S. nurseries and some program updates. I wanted to begin by mentioning that our program does have its own website, which I listed the address here, or you can just Google Phytophthora ramorum, and it's the first site that comes up. But I wanted to mention that in case you want to go back and look at anything more in depth that I talk about. There's some excellent links on this website. So if you were to open that website and scroll all the way down, if you open regulatory information at the bottom, that does list our federal regulations, federal orders, and has also this quarantine map where the current quarantine resides, which is 16 counties in Northwest California and one partial county in Southwest Oregon. And basically, if you're not in a quarantine area, you're not regulated unless they happen to find a positive, confirmed positive Phytophthora ramorum in your nursery. Then if that were to happen, you'd have to go under compliance for 3 years. And part of being under compliance, you have to notify all state regulatory officials in both the origin and receiving state anytime you ship host plants. You have to be inspected twice a year during times that are conducive for symptom expression for Phytophthora ramorum. And if you're found negative for those 3 years, then you can go off compliance and you're basically not regulated again if you're outside the quarantine zone. If you're inside the quarantine zone, however, the compliance works the same, but once you're off compliance, then you have to adhere to the federal regulations within that quarantine zone, which, as I pointed out on the webpage, if you want to go and look at the details of all that, you can. But it requires at minimum an inspection once a year, could be more depending on how recent the positive find was. You have to be inspected and you need a certificate to ship interstate that verifies that you've been found Phytophthora ramorum free. And if you are transporting through the quarantine area, you can't stop. You have to continue on. But if you do want to see, there's also some sampling nuances and stuff. You could refer back to the regulations, which are on our website. And if you want to see the specific requirements for our compliance agreement, that also can be found on our website under information for cooperators, which I'll point it out a little later in this presentation where it can be found. So establishments that were found positive for Phytophthora ramorum, I included 2023 since this year is not over. We mostly focus on nurseries, and then anything that's not a nursery is other. But for the last 2 years, it's been solely residences for others, so that makes it a little easier. We do break down our nurseries into interstate nurseries versus intrastate nurseries. So in 2023, there were 7 total interstate nurseries found, 3 of which had never been previously positive for Phytophthora ramorum, and 4 which had been. And this year there was 9 total nurseries, interstate nurseries, 4 of which had not been previously positive and 5 which had. In 2023, the intrastate nurseries, there were 16, 15 of which had not been previously positive, 1 of which had. And in this year, there's been 12 intrastate nurseries, 10 of which had not been previously positive, and 2 which had been previously positive in previous years. And then for 2023, there were 8 residences not previously positive, and this year 1. So for 2023, there were 31 total establishments that were found positive for Phytophthora ramorum, meaning they had at least 1 positive sample, but could be more. And this year, there were 22. So if you break that down to hosts, in 2023, there were 160 total positive samples of Phytophthora ramorum found in nurseries and or residences. The red on this chart is interstate nurseries, the purple is intrastate nurseries, and the orange is the residences. And you can see in 2023, rhododendron and camellia were the primary hosts where positives were found, but there's a plethora of other genera, including Cornus and Pieris and Prunus, that were found in 2023. And then this year, you compare it to this year, camellia, there were only 2 positive samples where we found Phytophthora ramorum. But again, rhododendron was predominant, and then Leuropetrolum followed, along with Cornus and Viburnum. So still speaking of hosts, I want to refer you back to the website. If you go back to information under cooperators, we have a list of proven hosts, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But while I'm on this page, I said I'd point out the compliance agreement, the sample compliance agreement. So under diagnostic sampling and response, 3rd bullet down, there's a sample of the compliance agreement if you want to see all the requirements while under compliance agreement. And then the 1st bullet under information for cooperators is our program manual, which is regularly updated. Most of the updates are, language, so it's less confusing. But there was recently added Appendix B, which is the Phytophthora ramorum Independent Site Assessment Tool. And this is a tool to determine if you have an establishment that's confirmed positive for Phytophthora ramorum, if you can possibly determine if a portion of that establishment can be treated as a separate establishment, which can get more nursery stock moving. That would be like for a nursery where maybe there's 2 field plots and they're separated by some sort of natural barrier, or not necessarily natural barrier, but some sort of barrier like a road. You would use this tool to determine if you could treat them like 2 sites versus 1. And there will be some more upcoming manual updates because we have an inspector checklist job aid that will be added to it. And of course, there's staffing updates, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. So if you, so going on to the proven hosts, the APHIS list of proven hosts and plants associated with Phytophthora ramorum, this was last updated in September of 2022. But they have developed a new policy that this is going to be updated yearly from now on, beginning this fall. It has not been updated yet this fall. It will be shortly, but there are 2 new hosts that will definitely be added to this list. The first one is Silverleaf cotoneaster. It's in the rose family. It's a woody shrub native to China, and it is established in California and Oregon and within the quarantine zone. The small printing here is the paper which confirmed it as a host, and that picture underneath it is the symptoms they observed. It was intercepted in May of 2022 in Marin County, which is in the quarantine zone, and they observed these symptoms, which are dark necrotic brown spots at the tips, sometimes on the margin, covering less than half the leaf, and they observed no symptoms on the twigs, no twig dieback. The second host that will be added is Cornus capitata. or evergreen dogwood. This is an evergreen tree or large shrub, native to the low elevation woodlands of the Himalayas in China, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. Again, the small writing is the paper, and to the left is the symptoms they observed. This was actually found, it was part of those bar charts I showed earlier in 2023. One of them was this. It was intercepted as part of a CDFA inspection of a nursery in Humboldt County, which is in the quarantine zone. And it was found on Cornus capitata mountain moon. The symptoms were these dark, medium to dark brown irregular leaf spots that were primarily in the midrib. And also 3 of the interceptions from this year of the Cornus were this Cornus capitata mountain moon. And then I mentioned staffing changes. There's been a lot of changeover in this program. The National Science Program Coordinator, Pat Scheel, retired at the end of May. And Dr. Lindsay Thiessen, who is a plant pathologist with domestic and emergency scientific support, has been with PPQ since 2021, has stepped into that role. And then the acting National Operations Manager, Betsy, retired at the end of March. Since then, we've had acting NOMS. Christopher Pierce stepped in for 4 months. He was a survey specialist covering Missouri, or he is a survey specialist covering Missouri and Iowa. I'm currently acting for 4 months. I'm normally a botany area identifier covering the seaports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And next up will be Nick Furlan, beginning November 17th. He is a pest survey specialist out of Illinois. And with that, I believe I ran over my time, so I want to say thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, or I left my phone number and my email, and don't worry about being after November 17th. I'll either answer it if I know it or forward it to who needs it. But I also did include the P. ramorum email box because the acting NOM does monitor that box. So whoever it is will get that email. Thank you. Oh, I probably
Thank you, Kristen. You were well within your time. Much appreciated. And yeah, we appreciate that update. And so Janice, the procedure I see is questions by chat. Does anybody have any questions? We do have a few minutes. Of course, we're always happy to be ahead of time if that works out. All right. Well, seeing no questions, and feel free to continue to, if you are able to stick around, Kristen, and any questions come in, we will direct them your way, but we really appreciate your update today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so next, we are lucky enough to have been sent an update from the UK. It's the middle of the night there, but 3 specialists from the UK have sent us updates from various parts of the UK and what both Phytophthora ramorum and Phytophthora pseudosyringae are doing over there. And so they have a pre-recorded PowerPoint that they have given us that hopefully will work for us to play it because it's got audio and PowerPoint slides together. And
I'm ready to share that
Kristen...
whenever you are.
Okay, I think we're ready.
Okay, let's see what happens.
Hello, my name's Mick Biddle. I'm the
Sorry.
Started out perfect.
I know.
response manager in the pathology team at Forest Research. Forest Research is the research arm of the Forestry Commission. We're based at Alice Holt in southeast England. That's where our headquarters are, but we also operate in Wales and Scotland. And with the help of my UK tree health colleagues, we've put together a UK overview of the forestry surveillance for Phytophthora ramorum in 2024. Before we launch into the update from the 4 UK countries, I'll give an overview of the surveillance and testing undertaken. At a forest level in the UK, Phytophthora ramorum predominantly affects larch species, and it's on this basis that the annual aerial surveillance programs in the various countries are based. These have been undertaken since 2010, and they're undertaken by helicopter, and they generate target sites which are followed up by ground visits, which in turn generate samples which are submitted to Forest Research for diagnostic testing. And in 2024, we've received so far about 800 samples from England, Scotland and Wales, but surveillance is still ongoing. All of the samples we receive are screened using a multiplex qPCR, which is new for this year, that we're using to screen for Phytophthora ramorum, Phytophthora pluvialis and Phytophthora pseudosyringae. And this is helpful because of the overlapping symptomatology and the overlapping host range of these 3 species that are all present in the UK. And then where we have Phytophthora ramorum positives, these are then tested using traditional PCR and sequencing, and lineage of the Phytophthora ramorum is determined. So now moving into the updates from England. These have been provided by Ben Jones, who's the Southwest Area Lead for the Plant Health Forestry team of the Forestry Commission. Ben manages the aerial survey programme for England. As of the 21st of October, the 2024 Forestry Commission Plant Health Team Aerial Survey Programme has monitored nearly 782,000 hectares of National Forest Inventory forest and woodland in England. In doing so, the Phytophthora ramorum Aerial Survey Programme has surveyed over 35,500 hectares of larch species across England, and that's nearly 90,000 hectares in private forest and woodland and 16,500 hectares in public forest estate managed forest and woodland. As of the 21st of October, these aerial surveys have generated 234 sites for follow-up survey on the ground. This is similar numbers to previous years, and they're distributed predominantly in the southwest, northwest and northeast of England in the general vicinity of previously confirmed infection. And the photograph there is a typical site of larch infected with Phytophthora ramorum in southwest England. The ongoing ground surveys are revealing a trend of increasing findings of Phytophthora pseudosyringae, either in isolation or in conjunction with Phytophthora ramorum. The confirmed findings of Phytophthora pseudosyringae are distributed across England with a higher frequency of findings in the northeast and the northwest. And the picture here is a site in northwest England with larch infected with Phytophthora pseudosyringae, so you can see the similarity in the symptoms. So moving on then to an update from Wales. This has been provided by Joe McMinn, who's the Senior Officer for Tree Health in Natural Resources Wales. And Joe says that an Ips typographus finding at the start of the survey season pushed back the Phytophthora ramorum work by about a month, because this impacted on surveillance and follow-up ground visit resource. 2 helicopter flights have been undertaken looking at Phytophthora ramorum, focusing on higher priority areas in Wales. There were sites left over from last year's flight which were visited on the ground this year. In total, there have been 172 sites in Wales investigated for Phytophthora ramorum, 60 of which had no evidence of infection with ramorum, and about 30 need a revisit with a chainsaw operator to fell a tree to get samples, because on these sites a sample couldn't be reached from the ground with a pole saw. Currently, up to this date, 11 statutory plant health felling notices have been issued, and this number will increase as the surveillance data from this year is processed. The number of statutory plant health notices this year in Wales is lower because there has been an increased number of Phytophthora pseudosyringae findings in Wales as well. And the decision has been made in Wales not to issue statutory plant health notices where pseudosyringae is found in isolation. It's not regulated in the same way that Phytophthora ramorum is. In past years, they may have issued a notice on suspicion of ramorum infection without necessarily a lab positive of ramorum, but this year they are erring on the side of caution And finally, there has been one sweet chestnut site where sweet chestnut has been found positive for Phytophthora ramorum in the core disease zone 1. That's it from me. I'm going to hand over now to Barnaby Wilder from Scottish Forestry. He's going to give an update, a detailed update from Scotland. And then after Barnaby, you'll hear Aoife Smith from Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Barnaby Wilder. I'm the Tree Health Operations Manager for the Scottish Forestry Tree Health team. And I'll just give you a quick update on the Phytophthora ramorum situation in Scotland. So the situation, to put in context, in 2023 to 24, the aerial surveillance and other reports identified 617 target sites, of which 353 turned out to be positive for Phytophthora ramorum, and that led to the creation of 198 statutory plant health notices to go and deal with those infected sites. This season, we've currently had 472 target sites created, and at the moment 207 have been found positive to date. We've only got another 20 odd sites awaiting visit, and there are a number of sites that have been visited and sampled or in analysis progress as well, so we haven't got the full picture yet for the end of the season, but it does seem to be less impactful than a 23-24 season. I think it's important to go and mention, I imagine colleagues in other parts of the UK will also report that the weather was very poor, and we had repeated poor weather conditions throughout spring and summer, and as a consequence that meant that flights were delayed and initiated later than planned, and the final flight in Scotland wasn't completed until the 16th of September. This graph goes and shows the number of targets that have been created in the last 10 years and the number of sites that have actually turned out to be positive for Phytophthora ramorum. You can see for the recent 5 years of surveillance, including the current year, there's been a decline in the amount of targets identified and a decline in the quantity of positive sites for Phytophthora ramorum. On this slide, though, we'll see that the number of target sites coming back with Phytophthora ramorum declining does not directly compare with the total area of a larch under statutory plant health notice. And we can see that there's been a relatively similar number of statutory plant health notices issued since probably 2017-18. So we don't know what the picture is going to be entirely for this year yet, so I haven't put the data on, but we can see that since 2018 there's been in excess of 1,000 hectares each year of areas affected by Phytophthora ramorum, and I believe that the 2024-25 areas are going to be similar to this and not a great deal lower. To put this in context, the data from Forest Research identifying the quantity of larch in Scotland shows you that there are in fact around 50-odd thousand hectares of larch remaining in Scotland that we're aware of that has not become infected. This is a series of maps illustrating the areas of Scotland where blue dots are where Phytophthora ramorum has been confirmed on larch, and in comparison to the location, the red area in Dumfries and Galloway, which has been a disease management area, which was considered too badly infested in up to 2012 and 13 to be able to be managed all at once. You could see that over time there have been findings scattered around much of Scotland with in larch, but they've generally been quite transient outbreaks. outside of what appears to be an established area over the last few years of land just to the east and north of that disease management area, and the islands and coastal areas of the central part of Scotland. And that is what the picture is of this current surveillance year as well. The high levels of sporulation that have been taking place for a number of years at some of these geographic locations have meant that other observations have been made with other terminal hosts becoming infected by proximity to high levels of sporulation. And we've been picking up signs of this, for example, with findings in fir species, in monkey puzzle, and also quite recently in eucalyptus too. This year, the weather that's been affecting the aerial surveillance has also been highly conducive for Phytophthora ramorum. So I know colleagues in the horticultural marketing unit have already been picking up high levels of rhododendron infection, and so we predict that 2025 could be an impactful year for Phytophthora ramorum. And finally, just to go and mention that, like other parts of the UK, we've been finding some larch that's been affected by Phytophthora pseudosyringae, albeit only 5 locations spread across the country this season. We're reinvestigating, resampling and monitoring these sites to go and see if it is solely pseudosyringae that is present, or if it is a combination of ramorum pseudosyringae. It certainly, initial observations suggest it is only pseudosyringae present on these sites, but we're working with colleagues in forest research to establish more information on the co-occurrence and also its pathogenicity. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Aoife Smith. I am a forester with the Forest Service in Northern Ireland. For 2024, we had a single flight which took place over the course of 3 days in June. This flight identified 58 locations for follow-up. 29 of these sites were indicated as having a high probability of P. ramorum infection. In general terms, we're seeing an increasing number of sites infected with Phytophthora ramorum in the west of the province. For the first time, we used leaf-baited waterway traps at 4 locations, which all returned positives. The diagram here shows the weather conditions from 1990 to 2021, which indicates that Northern Ireland is highly suitable for Phytophthora ramorum. Currently, the regulation in Northern Ireland applies to non-EU isolates. We still monitor using aerial surveillance and ground surveillance, primarily focusing on larch. This slide is just to give an overview of the timeline of spread from the first finding of Phytophthora ramorum in Northern Ireland in 2002 and its geographic spread and the latest findings in 2024. You can see in the arrow at the top right-hand corner where the first detection was, and also the area where there was first confirmation of the EU2 lineage. Down in the lower corner is the current westerly spread of Phytophthora ramorum. In 2024, EU2 is the most common lineage detected in forestry in Northern Ireland. The orange arrow in the middle of the map is the general location where there has been a very active and quite, in the context of Northern Ireland, large-scale spread of Phytophthora ramorum, and I'll give you a few more details of this in the next and final slide. This is the location in County Tyrone where Phytophthora ramorum was confirmed in mature 70-year-old larch in 2022. In 2023, Phytophthora pseudosyringae was confirmed in the same stand of trees. In 2024, there was death of 20-year-old hybrid larch in an area of approximately 1 hectare, and that was over that 12-month period. It became very evident in the landscape. In 2024, at this location as well, Phytophthora ramorum was confirmed on Pseudoheterophilia, again a 70-year-old stand. In conclusion, Phytophthora ramorum is active and spreading in Northern Ireland.
Okay, I really appreciate our colleagues from the UK being willing to provide that update, and I only wish that they could be here with us to answer questions, but they're sleeping peacefully, hopefully. So I am going to move on to an update on what Phytophthora ramorum is up to in our forests here in California. Let me see if I can get this going. And feel free to answer any or ask any questions as we go along. And keep in mind that this is just like with the UK, we're still gathering information on this situation as we do every year. And I certainly don't have the full picture. So I invite you, if you know of anything interesting or any areas of outbreaks that you want to call to our attention, feel free to put those in the chat as well. And from the outset, I want to acknowledge the people who are behind the information in this update. These are most of the sources that I have gathered this information from, but of course there are so many others working around the state, and there have been for the past 20 odd years that we have been doing monitoring of sudden oak death and Phytophthora ramorum in California. And so deepest thanks to all these people for all the work that they do, have done, and continue to do for this monitoring. So I always like to start when I'm thinking about Phytophthora ramorum and what it's been doing and where we've been seeing it. I like to think about what happened with precipitation in previous years and this current year. And so here's a little ongoing chart of winter precipitation. So this is November through June, 5 locations up and down the California coast from Santa Cruz County up through Marin County, Sonoma County, Humboldt County, and up into Del Norte County in the northwest corner. Interestingly enough, well, there are, you can certainly see some patterns going on of interest here. One is that we had quite a trough, as you know, in precipitation from 2019 through 2022. And then it picked up again, and we've had heavy precipitation for the past couple of winters. The other interesting thing that I see from this chart is that that black line is the southernmost location in Santa Cruz County, but it really is typically one of the wettest locations. And the blue line, which is the northernmost location, is relatively even in its precipitation compared to the Santa Cruz County location. The bottom line, the gray one, is Santa Rosa in Sonoma County, and that's pretty much the most inland, driest location on this chart. And it's fairly even in its dryness as well. But depending on what happens winter to winter, we pretty much can, count on seeing different things happening with sudden oak death. So we would expect after these last couple of heavy precipitation winters that we would see quite a bit of spread of Phytophthora ramorum across the California landscape. This is the USDA Forest Service Forest Health Monitoring Region 5 Aerial Detection Survey. It's sort of a synopsis of what they have tabulated over the past few years in the Central Coast and the Northern Coast. And tan oak mortality in particular is what we're looking at with this chart, with the orange bars being approximate number of trees that they've seen dead on the landscape when they fly over, and the blue line being acres that contain tan oak mortality. These aren't acres of continuous tan oak mortality. It varies from place to place as to how filled in those polygons of mortality might be. In some places it's scattered, in some places it's heavier. And what you can see is that it's dropped off a lot from that peak that we saw back in 2018 after, again, some very heavy winter precipitation in 2016, 2017. And it may be starting to tick up just a little bit this year, but still not much mortality that we've seen throughout all the coastal counties. Most of the acres with mortality this year were actually seen in Mendocino County, which accounted for about 3,400 acres that contained dead tan oaks. And so I just, for the rest of this short update, I just want to zoom in on just a few points of interest that I have personally seen, and with the understanding that hopefully we'll hear about some more from other presenters as we go along here today. In Del Norte County, which is there in the very top northwest corner of the state, this is the newest infested county that we have in California. And some developments have been seen this year. Just to go quickly over a little bit of the history of Phytophthora ramorum there. We picked it up in 2019 down in this spot toward the bottom of that map. Couldn't really find it again for several years in that location, but the next year we found it farther to the north. And these are two different lineages of Phytophthora ramorum, the bottom one being NA1, which is the one we've typically seen historically in California wildlands, the one at the north being EU1. And then this year we've seen a further development, and it takes place in that middle area between the two. And I'm going to zoom in on that. It's a place called Peacock Creek. This is a neighborhood with a mixture of residential development, California state parks or Redwood National and State Parks property, right next to the Smith River, culturally important site to the Tolowa Deni Nation. And we just found out last week that we have two lineages of Phytophthora ramorum present in this same location. They are EU1 and unfortunately a third lineage of Phytophthora ramorum, NA2. This is the same lineage that was fairly recently, over the past few years, detected in Oregon. Here at this site, these two strains are really intermingled with each other on the landscape. We don't know what the potential consequences of that might be. We have been talking with a variety of cooperators in the local area about the possibilities of what we can do to try to address the situation on the landscape here in this location. One of the interesting things about this is that the fact that NA2 has shown up here does seem to suggest that there continue to be introductions of Phytophthora ramorum into this local area. So rather than it being introduced one time and spreading from there, we have multiple independent introductions, it looks like, and that may be an ongoing situation. That Highway 197 corridor just to the east there is pretty heavily traveled. And also, as I said, this is a residential area. Just moving down the coast, just some brief looks at some other Phytophthora ramorum things that are going on. In southern Humboldt County at Humboldt Redwood State Park, we see the pathogen spreading this year. That picture on the left is a dead tan oak, and right in front of it in the foreground is a bay laurel. The picture on the right is a really, really big tan oak at the top of a ridge in Humboldt Redwood State Park. It doesn't look like it from my picture because of the angle I took it from, but it is one of the biggest tan oaks in probably the distribution of tan oak. It's really big, and we unfortunately detected Phytophthora ramorum on a sprout just a few feet away from this tree. And there are numerous other very large tan oaks in that vicinity as well. So that was a little bit of a downer to see that. Going down to Sonoma County, right on the banks of the Russian River, There were some small Douglas firs that had these symptoms, which you see every once in a while. Tip dieback, what will probably happen here is that these symptoms will dry up and fall off of the Douglas fir, but it does indicate something about the timing and the intensity of the precipitation this year. It means that it was raining heavily at the time when these trees were breaking bud and starting to put out new shoots. So fairly late in the sort of warmish coming into springtime period. So this could or might not, but maybe an indicator of things to come for sudden oak death in California over the next year or two. And then finally, I just wanted to end up with some lookalikes and confusing symptoms out there on the landscape. These two pathogens, one from Marin County, one picture from Humboldt County, are both pathogens that affect some of the same hosts as Phytophthora ramorum. The one on the left is a coast live oak. The one on the right is a tan oak. These are both pathogens that the plant pathologists at the CDFA Plant Pest Diagnostic Center have done a lot of work on identifying and naming and describing over the past several years. And while they appear to either not kill trees or kill them very slowly, you can see that their symptoms in a year that's conducive to spread can be pretty dramatic. Here are some more examples of Calinectria californiensis on bay laurel. While the symptoms can be really dramatic, as with the small bay laurels on the left, typically what seems to happen is that those bay laurels go ahead and immediately refoliate. You can see the ones on the right doing that in Humboldt County. And my final slide is just to underline and underscore the mystery of Phytophthora ramorum and how hard it can be to adequately detect and monitor this pathogen on the landscape. The picture on the left and the picture on the right are taken in the very close to each other. I think the one on the left is probably Phytophthora ramorum. That tan oak tree was dead, so it's hard to know for sure. The one on the right was definitely not Phytophthora ramorum, some other pathogen. So with that, I will stop sharing, and happily, I only have time really for a question or two. And let's see what we've got going on. The first question is on the Peacock Creek location. Do the new infections relate to nursery stock or to contamination connected to new development? And I invite our next speaker, Wallace Robinson, to address that question if they feel so inclined to do so, because Wallace has looked at this location more than I have, but I don't think we know. I think that there are all sorts of possibilities there. There's definitely a lot of residential development, whether there's outplanting of contaminated stock or some other kind of movement of the pathogen, we really don't know. And then the second question is why the uptick in tan oak death in Mendocino County? Anything interesting going on there? Which is a great question. Really, I have not been down there looking around enough, but there's a really highly dissected landscape in southern Mendocino County that has a lot of microclimates that are really conducive to Phytophthora ramorum local intensification in a really wet year. And so that's my suspicion as to what may be going on. It's not, from my observation, an extremely highly traveled landscape in those areas that are infested. So I'm less inclined to think that there's a lot of human mediated movement around the landscape, but once again, not sure at all. And the last question here, does this mean that Phytophthora ramorum will now be able to sexually reproduce? What has been done to mitigate that meeting of the lineages? So it does potentially mean that, but once again, it's terra incognita. Because sexual reproduction has been so rarely observed, we don't know what the likelihood of that is, although it seems theoretically that possibility is there. We are currently talking about what we can do to mitigate that meeting of the lineages. So far, we've been trying to intensively monitor what these strains are doing as they spread across the landscape. And management may or may not be possible in these situations. We hope it will be, but we'll keep you posted for the future. But I am about a minute over time, and so I want to move on to our next speaker, who, as I mentioned, is Wallace Robinson, who works for UC Cooperative Extension for Humboldt and Del Norte counties. And Wallace is a staff research associate who works with forest health issues, in particular with sudden oak death. And Wallace does a lot of monitoring of this pathogen around the landscape. So Wallace, are you ready to share your screen?
I think so. Can people see that?
We can see it. Thanks.
Okay, great. This is a whirlwind tour of North Coast stream monitoring results for the 2024 stream monitoring season. Okay, so as usual, we sampled streams 5 times between March and June, and between us and our partners, we monitored 41 sites in total across 3 counties. We're not really going to talk about Siskiyou, but the one site in Siskiyou was negative, so good job, Siskiyou. We are also going to go over Humboldt results, but before we do that, I'm going to explain how to read this and a few subsequent maps. So each of these dots represents a stream monitoring site, and the black dots have not had a positive detection of Phytophthora ramorum ever, and were similarly negative this year. The orange dots represent sites that have previously had P. ramorum detected at them, but were negative this year for whatever reason, possibly weather related. And then the red dots represent sites that have tested positive for Phytophthora ramorum this year. And so you can see that we have 2 positive sites. Those are Lax Creek and Chad Creek. Both of these have been previously positive, so no big surprises there. And we also tested 2 new sites along the coast just north of McKinleyville, but they were negative, so yay. And that's pretty much it for Humboldt. Unfortunately, Del Norte has lots of surprises to make up for Humboldt's lack thereof, which you may have inferred from Chris's talk. In 2020, there were only 2 creeks that were positive for Phytophthora ramorum in the streams themselves. This year, there are now 7 streams in Del Norte that are positive. I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but just for brevity's sake, the 2 new positives that we got were in the North Fork of Rowdy Creek and in Peacock Creek, which Chris just mentioned in his presentation. I'll note that Rowdy Creek did test positive last year in 2023, but we wanted to know where that positive signal was coming from. So we baited both the North Fork of Rowdy Creek and the South Fork, and we found that it seems to be coming from somewhere on the North Fork of Rowdy, which was a little bit unexpected because the South Fork is the one that actually shares headwater space with all of these other streams that are positive. So it is unclear exactly what is going on there. Because this area is complicated, we are going to zoom in now. So this is that same rectangle, but zoomed in and with a different color scheme. The reason for that is that we now are looking at strains of Phytophthora ramorum. So in this map, all the same data, all just from 2024 for right now. The gray dots are negative. The yellow ones we weren't able to get a clean culture of, and so they haven't been sent to a lab for genotyping yet. And the pink dots are the EU1 strain of P. ramorum, and the blue dot is our NA1 strain of P. ramorum. So obviously we can't say with entire certainty what the not yet genotyped results mean or what strain they are, but based off of the past few years of stream monitoring data, which I just put on this map, we can infer some things and also continue guessing at a lot of the other ones. So this North Fork of Rowdy Creek positive I think is probably likely the EU1 strain, because we know that Lower Rowdy Creek definitely has the EU1 strain in it. I would have said the same thing about this positive on Morrison Creek last year when it started testing positive, but now I'm not really sure because it's in a pretty agricultural area, and unfortunately things just continue getting more complicated in Del Norte County. So it's a little bit unclear to me what that's going to end up being. Lastly, this area on Peacock Creek probably has both EU1 and Na2 propagules in it. It's just not entirely clear what else could be going on there. So there's that same map of that Chris showed you, but there's that dot for the stream monitoring site. So yeah, that is all my time and all of the results that I felt like I needed to go over. I'll answer questions in the chat.
Thanks, Wallace. And I should have mentioned that Wallace provided those maps in the talk that I gave, so I appreciate that so much. There is we have time for one quick question, if you don't mind addressing that. There were two questions about the Hoopa tribe and the Hoopa reservation, and that Lax Creek positive is, somewhat close to the Hoopa reservation. Is the Hoopa tribe actively monitoring their streams currently, or do you have any other information about what's going on out there?
I think that someone just answered regarding the Hoopa tribe's steps to prevent the spread of P. ramorum. I know that they have that silvicultural prevention plan in place. I don't know if they have done any stream monitoring this year. As far as I know from my contact at Davis, that is not happening through them, but perhaps they've got another contact.
Okay, thanks, Wallace. We're going to move right along to Kim Corella, who is a forest pathologist with California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And Kim's going to update us on what's going on in streams in the southern part of P. ramorum's distribution in the coastal counties. So take it away, Kim.
So I'm just going to go over the results and surveys that were done in San Luis Obispo and Monterey counties this year. Maybe. There you go. The current infested county, as we all know, is Monterey County. So each year we conduct multiple surveys in San Luis Obispo County to try to detect sudden oak death. We do stream baits that were conducted this year from April 1st until beginning of June, saw blitz, and then I have interns that go out and sample the stream intensively to try to find any locations that were positive previously. So the watersheds that were positive this year were Salmon Creek. They were found positive in April and June, and San Copoforo Creek was also found positive this year in April. The ones that we're concerned about as well are Cincinnati Creek and Santa Rita Creek. Those were found positive in 2019, but have not been found positive since. So we like to do intensive surveys around those creeks to see where that positive location was found. I did move the stream baits 2 miles north in each of those creeks to try to pin down where those positive locations are. So they're moved from the red flag to the blue flag. Next year, I probably want to do multiple locations in those creeks to try to see if we can get positive locations and try to detect where that location was in 2019 that was positive. As I mentioned, we do surveys when we have the saw blitz. So County Agriculture and I go out to these 2 streams, sample any symptomatic bay laurels and turn those into CDFA. Those were negative for P. ramorum, but we did find 2 samples for Phytophthora pseudosyringae in each of those streams, each of those creeks. And then I have interns that I mentioned that sample those creeks intensively in about June, and they sample any symptomatic bay laurel on sites, on the homeowner sites where they get permission, and those were also confirmed negative from UC Davis. I just want to mention quickly too that We do helicopter flights around the county to detect any dead and dying oak or tan oak. They were combined this year with the U.S. Forest Service aerial flight surveys, and samples were taken from bay laurel, tan oak, and coast live oak, and those are all negative for sudden oak death. So future work, just continue survey along those streams for symptomatic hosts, really trying to pin down where those locations were in Santa Rita Creek and San Simeon Creek, and see if we can find out where that positive came from. But and then work with landowners to see if anyone planted nursery stock or something like that. But that's all I have.
Thanks, Kim. What I'm hearing is that we have another long time P. ramorum mystery going on.
Yes, we do.
All right. Okay. So I don't see any questions in the chat for Kim right now, but if any occur to you, feel free to throw them in there. And now we're going to move on to Matteo Garbolato from UC Berkeley. And I think Doug Schmidt is going to back Matteo up in case there's any technological issues that arise. But Matteo and his forest pathology and mycology lab run the sudden oak death blitz every year in the coastal California counties. And so we look forward to hearing from Matteo what happened with the sod blitz this year. So Matteo, you are live. But you may be muted.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, hi, everybody. So today I really will be given a few minutes and we'll present the program, how the program did, because remember, I will talk about a citizen science program, and then I will talk about the results, which are quite surprising. A lot of new information. So we did really well this year. We had 28 different blitzes, 28 because there are 20 different communities that participate across the state. We go all the way from San Luis Obispo to Del Norte. Even if Del Norte, we don't get all samples. We had strong participation, more than last year. We had 294 collectors, and we had 550 participants. People reported about almost 24,000 trees, and they sampled 1,100 trees over about 200,000 or 300,000 acres. The bottom line result is that finally, after the lag, remember, we're looking mostly at bay laurels and tan oak leaves. And so this anticipates what's going to happen in tan oaks and in oak trees. So we had a double of infection rates since last year. Remember, normally we see an increase with rain, but we didn't see it, probably because of the mega drought effect. But now finally there's an uptick, and both the infection rate and the and the number of positive samples was double that of last year. I don't want to talk too much about this, but people are very happy about the program. They're satisfied. One thing that we notice is that we have a decrease in number of participants that are newcomers, and that makes sense because sudden oak death is not in the news anymore. Only about 50%, which is still a large number of newcomers, but we have an increase of repeat participants, which makes the program particularly strong. And then, of course, we have a whole cohort of activities that go with the sod blitzes. We help managers to actually do something. And these are people that participate in the blitzes actually did something. And so this year, about 700 trees were treated, over 148 acres. And that's the cost because they let us know how much they spent and so forth. So again, we did survey more than 300 acres. We went, the 28 blitzes were in 18 counties. The results were excellent. We ran 2 different PCR tests based on 2 different loci. And again, if you look at the first row, the row on top, you will see the infection rate and the number of positives was roughly twice as much than it was last year. And this is the curve that everybody waits for. So this is the curve that we started doing in 2008. So we started actually with the data in 2008, and we're moving this data forward. So as you can see, finally, there is an uptick in infection rate, but there was a lag, which we kind of explained with the mega drought effects. But of course, we're not sure. The blue line is rainfall, and the orange line is the percentage of positives. And I don't have time to go through this, but basically, with 1 or 2 exceptions, every location had significantly more infection this year than it did last year. And this is a visual picture. You're used to this. You've seen it over the years. This is the scale of the effort. So again, the effort is very large, and we are very grateful to all of our collaborators. Again, green and red means negative and positive. North Coast, you've heard about the Nordi. We get a sample, but all those green in the middle are from the Karuk tribe. And their lands based on their efforts. So they pick where to sample, and everything was negative, so we're very happy about that. Mendocino and North Sonoma, we find that these locations are very indicative of whether we're going into an epidemic stage versus a chronic stage. And normally we get infection near Willits, and we do get infection in the Cloverdale area. When we switch, it's like clockwork. Every time we get it in Cloverdale near Willits, it means that infection rates are going up. I'm not sure whether they're really going to reach epidemic phase, but definitely the infection is moving. Sonoma, Napa, Marine. Sonoma, Marine, really high incidence this year, very high incidence. Sonoma, Marine, Napa remains negative. I mean, at least the bottom floor of the valley remains negative, and there was limited sampling on the sides of the valley with only one positive. So something is happening. So the mega drought is really changing the game for Napa until something happens. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We heard about San Luis Obispo, lots of samples, all negative. We're also very happy that all of San Francisco was negative. Both Golden Gate Park and the Presidio were negative for ramorum. And the east part of East Bay, Mount Diablo, and south of Mount Diablo, all the samples were negative. We have 3 nurseries that participate in the program, and we have the UC Botanical Garden that participates. All of them were negative. However, trees surrounding the nurseries in the East Bay and trees surrounding the Botanic Garden are positive. Carmel, Big Sur, pretty much status quo. Infection levels are relatively high, but again, they're in the canyons. We don't see infection moving in the valley, in the drier areas. That's probably indicative that something's going on. In the past, we've seen periodically the drier area the infection become viable in those areas, not so much. And Santa Cruz, we actually have a few new outbreaks in unexpected areas, both east and west of Santa Cruz, near Watsonville. There's actually those that you see just one sample. In the mountains, there's multiple samples that they're all stacked up because of the scale of the map is not large enough to show you all the infection. And then this is kind of the disaster area, but we sampled a lot of new groves, a lot of new sites for Mid-Pan, and there's a lot of new infections that have never been recorded before. And as you can see, this is obviously an area where infection is prevalent. So Mid-Pan will have a lot of work to do, but at least they have this information about these new outbreaks in the area. And then the big surprise is the rise of the NA2 in California, and this is statewide. These samples were collected in April and May, so they're the first collections of NA2 in California. And in multiple locations, in 5 different locations, samples came out as NA2. We do the sequencing. And by the way, we can determine the lineage using leaves. So if the North Coast people want to send us the leaves, we can tell you whether they're NA2, NA1, or E1. You don't need to have cultures to do that. We'll be happy to do that for free for you. So what we did, once we found out that we had 5 outbreaks, some of them very large, of NA2 in the Bay, all of them in the Bay Area, we went back to the original samples in the freezer. We reprocessed them from scratch. All of them came out NA2 again. Then we basically looked at where all of these samples were collected. We went back into the field and we resampled, even if in the fall, we resampled all the different 5 outbreaks. And we were able to reconfirm 4 of the 5 sites through DNA, and 3 of the 3 largest outbreak were also confirmed by culturing. So obviously it's very interesting that all of these NA2s, including in the north, but more importantly, these multiple outbreaks in the core of the distribution of the range of center of death are emerging at the same time. And as you can see in this picture, I don't know if you can see because it's a little busy, but the thick arrows indicate relatively large outbreaks, and the thin arrows indicate outbreaks that are identified by a single tree. And I will take you through this. So this is the largest outbreak. It affects 3 public areas. To the east, Edgewood Park, in the middle, Filoli, and on the west, the SFPUC land. All of the orange triangles are NA2s. This is the largest outbreak. We have 11 positive samples. We have cultures, and the maximum distance between the samples is 3 kilometers. Again, these were collected in April. The North Peninsula, Burlingame Hills, we have 8 samples that were confirmed twice as positive. They're all Na2. The maximum distance is 1 kilometer. There's an interesting difference here. All of the samples were Na2, not a single Na1, even if we know Na1 is there because we obtained it before. So this suggests that maybe with the drier weather, Na2 is being favored. And maybe this also explains why we got all of them at the same time. This is not just by chance, guys. So it's impossible to find different location. All of a sudden, after 18 years or 19 years of subblitzes, we're catching all of these Na2s. So something is driving the emergence of Na2. And because of the area that they covered, this is not incredibly recent. So these infestations have been going on for a few years, and I'll show you some data about that. In this case, if this is a cooler site, we have both Na2 and Na1 intertwined. You can see the orange and the red. Red is Na1, the orange is Na2. In this site, we have 4 samples that were positive. We were able to culture from them. This is a much smaller outbreak. This is just east of the campus, and it's about just 100 meters wide. And again, we have mixed Na1 and Na2 together. So we suspect these are younger outbreaks. In John Muir National, whatever it's called, monument or heritage site, we have 1 tree that was positive. We were able to confirm this by sampling ourselves. This was Na2 when we retested it. And then we have 1 site that only 1 tree. Again, it was in Tilden, but in the southern part of the south of Oakland. We were not able to confirm this one, so I won't spend too much time about that, but we're pretty convinced that it's there. So do we have information whether infection was there before? Yes, but unfortunately, nobody was looking for lineage. So we were not testing for lineage, but this is a picture of the largest outbreak. And as you can see, in 2021, it was the first time that this area was sampled and there were already positives. Even if you can see that in the lower picture, the positives for Na1 and Na2 are not totally fully overlapping. Certainly the disease was there. So I think it's probably likely that the disease, especially considering the extension of this outbreak, which is 3 kilometers wide, these Na2 have been there, but they've been swamped by Na1 until recently. Now Na2s are emerging. I did publish a paper that shows that Na2 is much more infectious, sporulates more in warmer temperatures than Na1. It sporulates about 4 times more, and it has been warmer, and there's been a lot less fog in this last year. So that would actually maybe suggest why Na2 is doing so well. But of course, this is just an hypothesis. This is difficult to see, but some of the trees were positive in the past. We didn't test for lineage, but probably at least since 2015, we had Na2 in this part of Burlingame Hills and Hillsborough. This is a very affluent community with a lot of ornamental gardens, so I'm not really surprised. We are going to go back to our DNAs from the past, and we're going to try to see if we can determine their lineage. So we actually may have some real data to see whether this, for sure, this Na2, this is a one kilometer in multiple properties. This Na2 has been there for quite a while. So what are our conclusions overall? Statewide outbreaks, it's an intermediate severity on the leaves. So it's going up, finally. It was really flattened out, but this year it's actually intermediate. And this is kind of if it rains another year, this is where it could go into epidemic phase, which means we would see oak infection and higher tan oak infection. Many new outbreaks in Santa Cruz County and in the Santa Cruz Mountains in general. The nurseries and the San Francisco parks are free of Phytophthora ramorum, and so is San Luis Obispo. It's a miracle. We don't know how, but at least we can't find it. These interior outbreaks, Lake County is wrong, Mendocino, again, also indicative that it's ramping up. And Na2 is all these Na2s are emerging at the same time, and we're finding them in 5 different locations at the same time. And so, and we have good data that suggests Na2 was there, but we were not seeing it. But for sure, the Filoli and the Burlingame Hills were not just introduced recently. And again, I already talked about the Na2. Take-home message of future outlook. So citizen science is invaluable to further our understanding of cellular death and to provide critical information to stakeholders in real time. So we're actually going to tell the landowners about these outbreaks. We don't really know what to tell them. We think that more intensive surveying is needed to understand how wide these outbreaks are. But if they're not particularly wide, maybe bay removal, if it's feasible, why not? We know we have too much bay anyway. And we're working with Richard Hamlin to genotype the Na2s. We have a good collection of Na2s, maybe to understand more of when these Na2s were introduced. And again, we will go back to our freezers and get the DNAs from previous years from these 5 areas, and then we will test the lineage and see whether Na2s were already there, but nobody was looking. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Matteo. Fascinating and horrifying, kind of in equal measure. There were some questions in the chat, but they were mostly logistical questions that I think other people were able to answer. I don't think there were any outstanding ones. Someone let me know if that's not the case. I think that this is so interesting because it shows, in conjunction with sort of looking for dead tan oaks, the sod blitz is so important and invaluable in showing what's going on with this leading edge of spread of the disease. And I have a question for you, sort of a third aspect of what has been happening ever since Phytophthora ramorum first came to California is movement through ornamental plants that are planted on the landscape and that are bought and sold. Do you have any thoughts about Na2 and what it has been doing all these years in that sort of nursery trade aspect of things? Because one of the nursery detections in California this year was also an Na2.
Well, as you know, I kind of stay away from the nursery. I only work with these nurseries for the sod blitz because they are in wild environment or in the urban environment of San Francisco. But, Na2 seems to, my recollection is Na2 can be dominant in the nursery industry, but it goes in waves, right? So it's not like a constant lineage that's found in the nurseries at all times. Some years there's like a shitload of Na2, and some years it's not that abundant. And to be honest, I was always very surprised that we never caught it before. And it seems to be, considering how abundant it was in the first years, when we just remember my lab discovered the Na2 lineage, right? Kelly Ivers. So we are the ones that discovered it, and we found a lot of it at the beginning when we were also working with nurseries, in the very first years. So it was kind of a surprise to me that it wasn't there. So I think the reality is that probably it has been introduced. I would say based on the distribution of these Na2s from ornamentals, there's no doubt. All of these sites, really, even the John Muir site, they're all near urban areas. Of course, affluent areas with lots of ornamental gardens. It makes a lot of sense that some of these ornamentals were probably the starting point for these outbreaks. They seem to be, relatively limited, and so I wonder whether we're looking at the later introduction. I don't think this is the introduction from the late 80s, early 90s, which is what, the early introductions in the East Bay and in the peninsula and in Santa Cruz County in particular were. So I think this happened, because, we were in those counties that were not fully regulated. And so it was possible that these Na2s could come in. I mean, nobody's fault. I mean, it was just kind of inevitable. And,
sure.
And I think that now finally we're seeing it. But I think the fact that all of these 6 outbreaks, if we include the North, all of 6 of them came out the same year, it can be by chance. So
right.
there has to be something that is driving Na2 to do better. And as it does better, we finally can see it.
Yeah. One other question for you. Can you tell us the fact that NA1 and NA2 and, also in parts of our landscape EU1, the fact that these are all present, what, in your opinion, implications are there for the pathogen's adaptability in the future?
Well, I think the problem is, the more immediate problem is that there's a paper that came out from Hansen group and a paper that came out from my group, and we both kind of in agreement that NA2 is ecologically different from NA1. So I think the first consequence is that we're basically ramorum now can cover more ground. Because remember, we always said that microclimate really affects ramorum, and you said it yourself. So there's some climates that are really favorable, and that's why the disease is so patchy. But now that we have two lineages that have different ecological adaptation, and that's, the data are pretty strong that they are different. So I don't want to say one is worse than the other, even if all data suggest NA2 is more aggressive. So I think the first problem is the two of them can cover more land. They can cover the landscape more. And if NA2 really is more infectious at warmer temperatures, potentially the disease can also move inland, where we have shown that the disease goes inland and then it dies out, at least on bay laurels. So we published a paper that shows that. But now with NA2, that may not be the case anymore. So what we reported with just NA1 may be slightly different. So that's my first concern. In evolutionary terms, NA1 and NA2 are the same mating type, so I'm not so worried about it. E1 and NA1 and NA2, that's a different story. We know in nurseries that there have been hybrids, so why not? If these infestations become really big, there could be hybridization, and that also spells trouble. But I'm more concerned about having two different beasts in the same place, covering really, giving a huge advantage to ramorum as opposed to only having one lineage.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Mateo. Thanks for this important information. Much appreciated. And again, if you have other questions, keep putting them in the chat. And for now, we're going to move on to our next speaker. And we're going to hear an update on what's going on with Phytophthora ramorum in Oregon wildlands, given to us by Sarah Navarro, who works for the USDA Forest Service as the sudden oak death pathologist for Region 6 in Oregon and Washington. And Sarah, thank you a lot for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we sure can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for the rest of the California Oak Mortality Task Force to inviting me to give this presentation today. We always like to keep our neighbors to the south informed of what's going on up in Oregon. I always like to start my presentations with the acknowledgement slide because our sudden oak death management program in Oregon is done cooperatively between the Oregon Department of Forestry, the Oregon Department of Agriculture, U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and Oregon State University. All the people on this slide contribute to our Oregon Sudden Oak Death program and the successes that we've had in our slow the spread effort up here. And so here in Oregon, we've been running a disease management program for over 20 years. It started out as an eradication program in 2001 with all infested sites of sudden oak death receiving some level of treatment. In the beginning, not knowing all of the information about disease biology that we know now, our sites were pretty small in comparison to what we're treating now. And so we've learned from the science, from research out of Mateo's lab, as well as Hansen's lab, and now Dr. Jared Laboldis's lab at Oregon State University. And so we shifted to our current Slow the Spread program in 2010. And like we were just seeing in Mateo's presentation, we have had new pathogen variants introduced into Oregon forests. And so the original variant that we believed was introduced in the late 90s to Oregon, but discovered in 2001 was the NA1. And then we have since had the EU1 discovered in 2015 and NA2 discovered in 2012. And so here is just kind of a graphical representation of where we started and where we are now in terms of pathogen location, spread, and also quarantine boundaries. And so here in Oregon, we do have a state quarantine. It is managed under the regulatory authority of the Oregon Department of Agriculture. It requires private and state landowners to treat sudden oak death on their properties. ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry, does pay for these treatments when required under the quarantine regulation. ODF works, Oregon Department of Forestry works under ODA's authority to enforce the sod quarantine down outside of Brookings, Oregon. That's where the office is located. And as I mentioned, we transitioned in 2010 to a slow the spread program. And so in 2012, we established what we call the generally infested area, which you'll see on the animation on the left show up in 2012 as that red box. And the generally infested area is an area within our quarantine that we now treat as one giant infestation. And we no longer require treatment on private lands within that area. We also don't allow for the harvest of tan oak out of that generally infested either. If private and state lands want to harvest tan oak from areas within our quarantine, they have to work with the Oregon Department of Forestry and Oregon Department of Agriculture to receive a special permit to do so. We require other non-bull hosts such as Douglas fir and Western hemlock to be washed. The logs washed on infested sod sites. And then we also require them to be free of any plant debris or soil, hence the log washing. Federal agencies, the U.S. Forest Service and BLM own quite a bit of land under our quarantine. And so we do follow state regulations and conduct sod treatments on our own ownerships as well in conjunction with the Oregon Department of Forestry. For aerial surveys, this year we conducted 2 helicopter surveys as well as 1 fixed wing survey. Our first helicopter survey was in May of this year, and then our second helicopter survey was in July, following up from our fixed wing survey to get exact points to go and ground check on the ground. From the aerial fixed wing survey. The fixed wing survey, we flew from the Oregon-California border all the way up to the Curry-Coos County border in a 1-mile grid pattern, about 8 miles inland. So we covered quite a big distance. We've increased our aerial survey since 2021 with the detection of sudden oak death in Port Orford. Before we were only going to Humbug Mountain, which I'll show in a map in just a little bit. We are still working to get back to pre-COVID survey coverage. We previously were able to do 4 helicopter surveys per year. So we're hoping to get back up and running this year. It's been a little wonky here in Oregon in terms of contracting and having staff who are certified safety-wise and training-wise to be in the helicopter. So we're slowly working our way back up. Still getting good information there. Next, we have our ground-based transect surveys, which we are doing year-round. And we do them for multiple reasons. We do them for delineation of treatment sites. As I mentioned, those special permits that are available to landowners to do timber sales and remove tan oak from the site. So they request a pest-free certification, and ODF foresters will go on the ground and do a transect survey. We also do high-risk areas based on risk models and stream baiting results. The risk models are ones that we're using from North Carolina State University. We have found this to be the most effective for early detection. However, it is the most costly. A 2-person crew can only cover about 40 acres per day. For stream baiting for this year, we have been monitoring 63 stream basins. These range all the way from the Oregon-California border off of the Winchuck River up into just outside of Port Orford, and drainages that are coming off of the Elk River. 6 streams so far have tested positive for Phytophthora ramorum through plate culture methods. And 12 streams have tested positive for Phytophthora ramorum through qPCR methods. Once we have a stream that's tested PCR positive, we then have the OSU lab start to get a culture out of those streams. So they start plating those stream bait leaves as they come in. 10 of our 63 streams are following the national stream monitoring protocol requiring testing by 2 labs. So they're being tested by Dr. Jared Laboldis's lab, as well as the Oregon State University Plant Clinic. These positive results are used to set ground survey priorities. And we have been working on the ground up off of the Elk River to do we have ODF foresters who have been on the ground multiple times to do surveys there. So once we find an infested site, we go in and do a treatment. So our sun oak death disease treatments, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this slide before, but just in case there's some new folks on the call, just wanted to kind of explain what we do in Oregon. So once we do find an infested site outside of the generally infested area, we do a host removal treatment. This involves cutting and burning tan oak within a set treatment buffer. Early on, we defined the treatment buffers between 50 and 100 acres, and we have since moved to larger treatment areas of a 300 to 600 foot buffer. And for a single tree, that equates to between 1 and 6 acres. It costs between $3,500 an acre to up to $10,000 an acre, depending on size of the tan oak, density of tan oak, as well as slope of the site. As I mentioned earlier, there's no cost to private landowners where treatment is required by the quarantine, but there's also no compensation for their loss as well. And we do replant with Douglas fir or coast redwood if we have a big enough opening. We do maintain a public sun oak death dashboard where we are tracking all of our treatments as well as our surveys throughout the year. And we have been focused to the northern edge of Curry County since 2021. We started off in 2021 with 2 new detections outside of our sod quarantine area that was established in 2015. It was 21 miles north of any known infestation and 13 miles away from the Curry-Coos County line. Originally, it was detected by Ebba Peterson, a researcher at Oregon State University, and we were hoping that it was just a couple trees along the side of Highway 101. We have since gone in over the last 3 years and continued to find infested areas. Within there, we've done over 350 acres of treatments. It has been pretty slow going because of the amount of private landowners within that area, but it is still ODF's #1 priority to be working on. In late 2022, we had our first detection just south of Port Orford in Humbug Mountain State Park area. This was done just by an ODF sod forester. She was walking her dog on a trail one weekend and saw some infested tan oak. We collect high resolution imagery every single year, and we could not detect these trees in the newest batch of imagery that we had gotten. So it was still a relatively new infestation at the time. We had to go through the official USDA APHIS protocol to confirm Phytophthora ramorum because it was a brand new location. Lineage testing has come back and it's a mix of NA2 and E1. There's only a few EU1 trees in there, and we were not able to retest those trees because of the time between when we received lineage results and the treatment had already been conducted, and so the trees had been cut down. ODF and the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department have been working closely on the treatments. We've also, too, because of its proximity to BLM lands, the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service authorized the use of Good Neighbor Authority funds for the treatment on state parks lands to reduce the risk of spread to federal lands. So we were able to use a pot of money that had originally been set aside for BLM lands, but use it on state lands to reduce the risk. And so we had set up the Good Neighbor Authority Agreement in 2020 between the Bureau of Land Management and the Oregon Department of Forestry. Spring Surveys has shown multiple new infestations outside of Port Orford. So this is Humbug Mountain. So this is the original Humbug Mountain site. We now have, and then this is Port Orford. We now have an additional site in between at Hubbard Creek. And then we have a scattering of sites now in between Port Orford and the north bank of the Rogue River. These have come back as mostly EU1 trees, as well as some NA2 trees within here. And so this purple line that you see, this is our emergency state quarantine. And so this is activated automatically. It's a 3-mile radius based on a new infested site. And so funding for 2024 as well as 2023, we've seen a stable trend in funding. We've seen an increase in state funding over the last few years, and we have seen an increase in funding through USDA. The Oregon State University Forest Pathology Lab has been receiving $1.2 million over the last 4 years through USDA ARS and through a direct appropriation as a result of resulting from our Oregon Sudden Oak Death Task Force. So we are planning to expand our quarantine later on this year. We have been working under the 2015 quarantine for the last 4 years, last 3 years, with just then establishing those emergency quarantine areas. And so we do need to officially expand our state quarantine. And so we are looking at expanding it to approximately 901 square miles, up from 515. So going from 30% of the county to 45% of the county. We're also looking to expand our generally infested area to take in sites along Pistol River, Myers Creek, and Hunter Creek, where areas that are a lower priority for treatment and slowing the spread further north into Coos County. And so the boundaries that we've proposed are based on the current direction and rate of spread, as well as modeled tan oak presence. And this is from North Carolina State University. They provided us with this model earlier on this year. In looking at our high resolution imagery, it does do a really good job of modeling tan oak presence as you're pretty close to the coast. However, it does have an overestimation in areas with other deciduous forest types, like as you get further along the Rogue River, where you switch into more of a canyon live oak or California black oak areas. And so we are looking at doing a rule amendment to our state quarantine. It's going to take about 2 to 3 months. We've been working with notifying stakeholders, doing outreaches to form a rule advisory committee to help ODA drafting that language and making sure that we have all our stakeholders in Oregon and that have been a part of the SOD task force on board. So with that, take any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. There is a question that I would appreciate if you would answer for us. Do you have any information about the P. ramorum infestation near Lincoln City?
I do. I actually went out there in May with Bruce Molson. He was in town visiting. And so the Oregon Department of Agriculture is the lead agency on that. And so they have been working with the Botanical Garden, which was one of the larger infested sites there. So they have been working on doing plant removal and remediation at that Botanical Garden. ODA has also been trying to work with the landowner or the homeowner there that had multiple infested plants on their property. And so that's been kind of slow going for ODA. ODA also they were in a holding pattern because they didn't have any funding to do treatments. And so last year, Forest Service, I was able to carve out a little bit of our congressionally directed SOD funding that we get for the U.S. Forest Service. I was able to carve out $150,000 for Oregon Department of Agriculture to do those eradication treatments.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah, for that update. We do have a pending question in the chat, but I don't want to take up any more of people's break time because we are moving into a break. Hopefully either if you don't mind addressing that chat question, or we can do it at the end of the whole meeting as well.
I can address it. I actually have to hop off for another meeting.
Okay, yeah.
But I can address it in the chat. We have some really good we have a really good economic impact assessment that was completed in 2019, and then a legislative report for our Oregon Ways and Means Committee that does look at the effectiveness of our treatments. So I'll throw those into the chat for folks.
Thank you, Sarah. That's awesome. Really appreciate it. Okay. Thanks to all our speakers for the first half of this meeting. We're going to have a break now for about the next 5 minutes or so. So if we come back at about 2:41, do you think that sounds workable, Janice?
I think that sounds perfect. Thanks, Chris.
Okay.
So as we come back in and we get into the last few presentations, feel free to read through those. If you're a presenter that hasn't had a chance to respond to those, go ahead and put those into the chat. And any other questions that are coming in, it's a great way for us to be interactive in this meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Janice. So we're moving into some reviews of research related to Phytophthora ramorum now. And so our first speaker in the second part of our meeting will be Richard Cobb, who teaches at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and he's going to talk about work that he's been doing in Marin County on Mount Tamalpais related to sudden oak death for quite a few years now. So thank you, Richard, for being here.
Could you give me authority to share, please?
You should have that. I just made, oh, sorry. There you go, Richard.
All right, we're rolling. Okay, thanks everyone. This is a little bit different here. I'm gonna give a very brief overview and really try to make one point about these highly impacted stands that have been impacted for a long time. And I thought it was worth sharing with this group because, you know, we reached the 10-year post-treatment date, and there are some things that are just pretty simple that I can share with you. So to give you thanks to everybody who worked on this, which is a lot of people. And excuse me, it's basically, without getting too much into the weeds here, we did a whole bunch of different treatments, different kinds of mastication, prescribed fire, hand crew thinning. And we've been monitoring these studies for 10 years, surveying them every 5 years. There's Allison Simler-Williamson on the last of these surveys in 2019, the previous survey in 2019. And what we realized 5 years after we had established these treatments was that they were not going to persist and without some sort of maintenance. And these are living systems. Of course, sudden oak death, Phytophthora ramorum, kills the above ground parts of tan oak, and it resprouts prolifically. We could see this initially that we were going to have a problem, and or at least that most of our treatments were not going to have a long-term persistence. And we found exactly that. So 10 years later, we had some successes, clearly running these masticators around, burning and so forth. It changes the forest structure in ways that the managers we were working with were trying, those were the goals that they were trying to achieve. So success. Problem, as I say, is that these are living systems and they come back really, really strong. We have many of our most impacted stands simply appear to revert back to the conditions that they were before we did these treatments, and it looks like a real problem. The one thing I should say, well, I'll continue here. We just finished these surveys just about a month and a half ago. So I'm not showing you data. I'm just going to show you some photos, although I have pretty high confidence that the data will bear out these trends. And it's not always tan oak. We have problems with vaccinium as well in these systems. And it's just, this is not good, right? It's we were trying to reduce density, reduce the contagion of overstory fuels, reduce inoculum pressure, and the systems reverted back to where they were. Now, the good news is that we do have a way of dealing with this, and that's to do a regular follow-up every 2 years at much lower cost, using hand crews with small saws. You can maintain the low density conditions and manipulate host composition just by having somebody out there go through and maintain the treatment. It really seems to work when you do it. And we even have some other things that are intriguing. Perhaps some more recruitment of redwood. That's definitely something that needs to be tested rigorously, but that's a goal of these treatments. And the other thing that is clearly coming up here is that sometimes the treatments are persistent with no follow-up. And it's important to ask why. This is not just in this study in Marin County, but also we've seen a similar trend in some of our treatments in Lax Creek in Humboldt County, which is actually uninvaded by ramorum. And up there, we've had we've done a pre-invasion treatment. It's actually never been invaded. And we've had pretty persistent benefits in terms of reduction in density. And what it really seems initially, and this needs to be rigorously tested, but the initial overstory conditions are influencing how much recovery of these high density conditions we get after treatment. And this is an example also from Marin County, where we did the treatment, we cleaned up a bunch of resprouting and dead fuels and so forth. And 10 years later, it looks a lot like it did right after we did the treatment. So this brings up this question, where do you treat? Because retreating is quite expensive. So here's what we're kind of looking at, and sort of the way to sum up this very briefly is the treatments work initially. They do, running this heavy equipment, doing fire and so forth. It definitely works, but as I say, these are living systems and they recover quickly. They really appear, we'll test this rigorously, they appear to recover completely to their pre-treatment condition within 10 years. So we would expect that any of the benefits that we gained by doing the treatment are lost. So what should we do? Should we invest in the follow-up maintenance that costs about $10,000 every 10 years? The initial cost was about $10,000, and presumably retreating untreated stands after 10 years would cost that again. It's unrealistic to expect that the treatment costs wouldn't change because everything gets more expensive, of course. But what we expect right now is when we go back in 5 years, that we will, in untreated areas, if they're left untreated, we will start to see the emergence of symptoms and perhaps even a recovery of the dead fuels, which we were aiming to remove here. Furthermore, these systems do have intact overstory tan oak that are quite valuable, that we want to maintain as part of these stands. And one of the aims was to reduce inoculum pressure, and that seemed to work initially. And there is this question about whether we will be able to maintain that over the long term without some sort of follow-up. And that's it, really. I wanted to just make that one point. If we're going to do these treatments to maintain these stands, we're probably going to have to invest in maintenance treatments.
Thank you, Richard. I have a question for you, if you don't mind. I'm curious as to what other sorts of variations on this management that you are working on in other locations in the coastal counties.
Sure. Yeah, it is a network of treatment sites. And another important contrast is a new treatment that was just established this year at the SoCal State Demonstration Forest. And that one's notable because it includes a commercial harvest of redwood. So that's really going to potentially test this conjecture that maintaining an intact overstory will suppress the resprouting of tan oak and perhaps give us a longer term benefit in terms of reductions in density. My wish list, though, here is to use herbicides. I'm not a big fan of using herbicides. I would prefer it if we used less, but the conditions are so problematic and they come back so vigorously. It does seem to justify experimenting with another tool. I have to say this, in the areas that I'm working in, especially in Marin County, it's just never going to happen. There is no public support for the use of herbicides, even in an experimental setting. So we're going to have to look elsewhere to try to test those treatments. And that is a call, I suppose, for collaboration or help among the community here. If you are interested in looking at that, I'd be very happy to talk to you more.
Up in the North Coast, we do have some experience with working with herbicides. And so, you know, we'll keep talking with you about future opportunities, because there probably are some up here in this neck of the woods. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that update. And moving on to another member of the Phytophthora ramorum and general forest health research community. Really happy to have Allison Simler-Williamson, who has done a lot of work also with sudden oak death in California and is now at Boise State University. And Allison is going to talk about changing forests in Big Sur. So Allison, thanks for being here, and we're ready to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a new project that's just getting off the ground. So this will be sort of a high-level overview, and we're really interested in input and feedback. We're interested in exploring how interactions between sudden oak death and other disturbances like wildfire may be causing state shifts from forest into chaparral types, and specifically in coastal California. Before I dive in, I just want to say a quick thank you to the collaborators on this project, as well as this work is going to leverage a long-term data set that's the product of so many hands over the last 20 years that I couldn't possibly mention them all here, but these are some really valuable people without whom it wouldn't be possible. And so we're particularly interested in the way that sudden oak death creates a new kind of biotic disturbance in these landscapes. So this is a disturbance regime that these ecosystems haven't seen before, caused by Phytophthora ramorum. And over the last 20 years or so, this group of collaborators has explored the impacts of sudden oak death on various ecological scales. So thinking about the persistence of susceptible host populations, the assembly of communities, and ecosystem processes like biogeochemical cycling and wildfire. And we've done that using this repeat measurement network in the forest of Big Sur that was established in 2006 and has been monitored at varying intervals all the way to the present. It's a large data set in this coastal range that you see shown here that captures a range of sudden oak death impacts from completely uninfested areas that have stayed uninfested through the entire scope of this project, all the way through to early invaded and highly impacted forest stands. But it's also captured a range of fire histories that you can see with the different shaded polygons here, where we have the impacts of a 2008 Basin Complex fire, the 2016 Sobranes fire, and the 2020 Dolan fire impacting some of these plots. And what's novel about this work is that we had already started measuring these forests before those fires occurred, so we have the capacity to compare before and after data in this large observational design. And many of these fires have overlapped, resulting in up to 3 fires in many of these areas since 1999, which is a pretty small fire return interval. And so members of our team have been using this work to study how sudden oak death alters forest communities and populations, things like where we expect susceptible hosts like tan oak to persist, as well as how we expect the entire community to shift in composition. But one of the interesting things that came out of this work following the first set of fires that impacted this network was findings that suggested that sudden oak death had the capacity to alter fire behavior and its impacts, and post-fire impacts. And so, for example, as the disease progresses in these forests, what we found is that the disease alters fuel profiles differently, depending on kind of the progression of the disease, where standing dead fuels become common in the earlier stages of disease impacts, and then coarse woody debris or these large logs become common as those fuels age. And then those different fuels have different interactions with wildfire if a wildfire occurs, depending on where temporally a stand is when that fire hits. And so we'll get increased canopy severity, increased above ground tree mortality, meaning those stems of these trees, which Rich just did a really great job illustrating how the resprouting dynamic is an important factor here. And then we get increased surface fire severity and increased mortality of those resprouting genetic individuals as we have these kind of the accumulation of coarse woody debris. And we've also detected changes in post-fire regeneration because of these fire impacts, as well as changes in soil biogeochemical processes related to the fact that these fuels have changed, the litter inputs have changed, and the impacts of fire, and therefore the volatilization of certain soil resources have changed too. And so as we continued to monitor these plots over time, what we started to find was some evidence that these repeated disease fire disturbance interactions may have the capacity to erode the resilience of these forests, so their capacity to come back after a wildfire as forest. And so this is a single plot shown here in 2006 with sort of minimal impacts of sudden oak death at the time. And following an initial fire, that basin complex fire I mentioned, you can see sort of all of these dead trees that have pretty prolific resprouting at their bases right now. And then when we return to that plot in 2011, those trees are clearly coming back. They're starting to gain some height. You can barely see the person with the little clipboard behind them. And so there's some evidence of resilience here where this system is coming back largely as it was before. But following a second fire, we saw this particular stand transition to be completely dominated by Ceanothus, which is a non-resprouting shrub in this particular system. These are non-resprouting Ceanothus that come out of the soil seed bank and completely dominate this stand. And so this is transitioned following a second fire into a shrubland. Whether or not that's a persistent shrubland, we don't know yet. But following a third fire in 2020, you can see that this is pretty shortly, this is in the year right after the fire. You can see that there's pretty much all of those resprouting individual trees have been removed either through the repeated fire or sudden oak death or some combination of the two. And so some of these kind of observational findings over the course of our work in the system prompted us to start to question whether or not disease fire interactions had the capacity to actually shift ecosystem dynamics in a way that favored shrublands over these typically dominant forest species. And so we started to explore this question. These are some results from an analysis led by Nina Wurzberger, a collaborator on the project, to try to investigate whether these disease fire interactions could potentially facilitate shifts to nitrogen-fixing chaparral species. And so that Ceanothus shrub that I mentioned in the last slide is a common post-fire colonist, but it's also a nitrogen fixer that has the capacity to outcompete tree seedlings. And so we were exploring that here. And so what we found was
Oh, could I interrupt you for a second? Sorry, you're not in you're in your presenter mode.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sure that doesn't much matter. There are no notes, so it will work as is, I think. Can you still see that now?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, great. I'm sorry for the unpleasant aesthetic, but hopefully this will serve our purposes for now. So the probability of Ceanothus establishment on the y-axis here is generally increasing in this system as we have more fire and as we have more severe sudden oak death impacts before the subsequent fire disturbances. There's also relationships with climate where the kind of hotter end of our climatic range seen in the system is facilitating the colonization of Ceanothus, or at least appears to correlate with the colonization of Ceanothus. And so we are starting to kind of probe some of the mechanisms by which Ceanothus establishment may become more likely because of this repeated disturbance. And so we're curious whether the losses of these typically really persistent resprouting tree species through disease before the fire and disease-fire interactions may play a role in these transitions. We're interested in whether tree seedling recruitment is altered underneath these ceanothus sands, which we have some preliminary evidence here that you can see as ceanothus basal area neighboring seedlings increases on this x-axis, we get a decrease in tree seedling survival across some of our dominant species. We're also interested in whether those post-fire nutrient dynamics, which Rich Cobb's past work demonstrated can be different because of the impacts of sudden oak death following a wildfire, might actually result in different benefits for being a nitrogen fixer, creating a scenario in which these nitrogen fixing shrubs have a sort of different competitive ability in sudden oak death impacted areas. And whether shifts to ceanothus or some chaparral species could actually alter future fire behavior, maintaining these systems as new patches of chaparral. And so we just received some funding through a National Science Foundation award to explore these questions, more specifically, whether these repeated disease-fire interactions alter the starting conditions of communities in ways that benefit chaparral species, and whether those interactions actually can make those shifts persistent or relatively permanent over long time horizons due to either the impacts on the disturbance itself or the impacts on competition-related feedbacks that kind of keep that system as shrubland. And so what we're going to do is use a combination of new manipulative experiments that try to probe some of those biogeochemical mechanisms and those plant-plant competition mechanisms, as well as some long-term forest census data from the long-term monitoring network that I mentioned before to understand the potential for fire vegetation feedbacks, as well as some epidemiological modeling and process-based forest modeling to try to predict how persistent these transitions to shrub and might be and where they're likeliest to occur. And so we're just getting started with this project. We literally began this grant maybe a couple weeks ago. And so we're eager to chat more and learn from this community as we begin and as we start kind of trying to understand some of these mechanisms. We're also recruiting several graduate students here at Boise State with me, as well as with collaborators Nina Wurzberger at University of Georgia and with collaborator Ross Mentemeyer at NC State. And so if you know of any interested applicants, please feel free to forward them our way. And with that, I'll just end with one last thank you to everyone who made that long-term monitoring effort possible. Thanks. And sorry for the...
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. Sorry it took me so long to mention that, but thanks for
totally
that.
Good. I have two screens, so I
got it. It's pretty amazing how the how much answering of in-depth ongoing interesting ecology questions that long-term plot network is enabling. Really nice stuff. I don't see questions in the chat for Allison right now. If anybody has any, feel free to throw those into the chat. Lot to think about there. Thanks so much, Allison.
Thank you.
Yeah, and moving on. If I can get to my screen here, we are moving to our last researcher for the day, who is going to introduce herself to us. And this is someone who is actually really needs no introduction to the sudden oak death community because she's been around and working in it for a very long time. This is Shannon Lynch, who is an assistant professor of forest pathology and plant disease ecology at UC Davis. So thanks for being here, Shannon.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I am just literally here to introduce myself today and introduce myself back to the community. So for those of you who don't know me, hi, everybody. My name is Shannon Lynch. I am a new faculty member in the plant pathology department at UC Davis. And just so for some of you who don't know me, it's actually really, really fun to see just how much the research has evolved on sudden oak death. I used to be a technician in the Rizzo lab back in 2001, where I was involved in a lot of the early research on the ecology and epidemiology of sudden oak death and getting some of that early work established. So that's where I started my journey into forest pathology. And then I moved down to Southern California and did work on oak diseases at UC Riverside, where I described and identified new fungal pathogens of oaks down there, and characterize how oaks were experiencing decline associated with gold spot oak borer in areas that were diseased and non-diseased, and affected and non-affected, I'm sorry, by gold spot oak borer. And then invasive shot hole borer exploded, and I started working on that, and went back to UC Santa Cruz and did and that was the topic of my PhD dissertation. And then I went on to get a faculty position at State New York University College of Environmental Science and Forestry, where I was there for 2 years working on beech leaf disease and chestnut blight and all sorts of fun things on the East Coast before coming back to California. So I'm really happy to be back. I'm generally interested in using phylogenetic ecology tools to understand how emergent pathogens spread across heterogeneous landscapes. And I'm also interested in how host microbiomes influence disease establishment, and how that influences how disease spreads and establishment in space and time. And I'm just really happy to be here and really excited to get to know all of you who I may have not been introduced yet to. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Shannon. It's really awesome to have you in the California plant pathology, forest pathology community again, because as you know, we can never have enough expertise to cover what's going on here. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much. I'm wondering now at this point in our meeting, because what we have agendized for now is just a recap of the meeting. I'm wondering if Allison is still around, because a question has come up for her. Allison, are you still there?
I'm here.
Nikki Hansen asked, how do you separate the effects of increased fire frequency from the effects of sudden oak death and increased tree mortality pre-fire? She says, it seems like ceanothus and other seed sprouters will also, what I lost the comment as I was trying to go from one part.
I've got it here, and I was writing just a brief version back, but I can elaborate just briefly about that. So that's actually one of the, I think, particularly data analysis and experimental design wise interesting things about having this long-term data set, because we have the before data and the after data, which as a statistical control and as a tool for isolating the effects of pre-fire disease impacts from fire impacts makes things a little bit simpler, because we can isolate what was likely to have been caused by disease versus what was likely to have been caused by fire. But also, as we all know, that the disease, and this came up in several talks before, the disease is not happening randomly across the landscape. It has environmental correlates, which also may influence fire. And so we can use different statistical designs to try to isolate what fire might have looked like in a plot without sudden oak death related fuels versus how it actually appeared with sudden oak death related fuels. And so this is the sort of thing that if you don't have the before and after data, it gets a little bit more complicated, but that's one of the fun things about working in this data set. And then the ceanothus is in this ceanothi, I should know that by now, but are predominantly not resprouting, they're obligate seeding ones. So they tend to win the race to putting their seeds back in the seed bank compared to the tree species coming back from seed if they have to come back from seed. Whereas the resprouting genets are really persistent, grow really fast, and can overtop the ceanothus relatively quickly if they still persist. But the issue we're coming up against is that I think we're seeing some places where those genets are being removed by both factors. So.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for doing the double duty of writing and answering. I was obviously not keeping up with what was going on in the chat, so
That's
thank you.
It's not easy facilitating the remote.
Shannon, you and Tom had an interesting exchange there, and there was another comment earlier in the meeting about sod and acute oak decline. And that to me highlighted the kind of necessity or the possibility in the future of sort of not concentrating on these just single agent models of what's going on to trees, but maybe trying to figure out when more than one thing is going on at a time. Do you see more possibilities in the future because of sort of the sorts of better assays that we have and that are being developed and sort of developments like that?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot more things that go on to oaks, and looking at how they interact with one another is definitely particularly interesting. A lot of canker pathogens affect oaks, and the we are starting to have we're starting to form a group to talk about acute oak decline, just to get our arms wrapped around it. Tom and Kim and several of us, just to start doing do the pathogenicity tests and start to do more surveys to just see really where is it and what is it actually doing, to really get a sense of what's going on with that. But uh, doing, I was telling Tom on the chat, developing something like a LAMP assay to be able to, in the field, those are early detection assays that you can develop that, within 30 minutes. Once the assay is developed, you can actually determine whether or not, if we're doing it for acute oak decline, we can determine whether or not the bacteria that is putatively the causal agent is there or not. We can determine that within 30 minutes once the assay is developed. And so I think those kinds of tools are really important to have, to be able to rule out whether you have certain, sudden oak death or, these other things that also cause bleeding cankers.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably going to be learning a whole lot more about the involvement of various bacteria and various disease syndromes in the future. Thank you, Shannon. Yana Valikovic has a question or a comment for everybody, and so I would like to call on her now to ask that question.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, everyone. What a dynamic day. And I appreciate some of the cathartic comments about, boy, it never seems to get any better. And the rascally comments about how this pathogen always seems to be 20 steps ahead of us and mutate in some new way or do something that is unexpected. But I've been just sort of thinking about this, and not Matteo, if you're still on here, but this idea of synchrony, this idea that you could have multiple things happening at the same time, or a similar thing happening at the same time in multiple locations, especially around NA2, has me thinking about this climatic interaction and how one might think that through. And the situation in Del Norte is totally caught us off guard. We only have 5 or 6 days since we learned the news of finding NA2 and haven't had much chance to really digest that. But now to couple that with Matteo's discovery, the piece I'm trying to think about is like, how would you assess synchrony without enough sample replicates across the area to know that that could be occurring? And the weather patterns are so different between the northern end of the range of sudden oak death and the central range of sudden oak death. Could you really find some kind of weather signal that the pathogen would be responding to? Our heat events are not the same in Del Norte as they are in the Bay Area. We get precipitation much earlier, much longer and later, and cooler weather overall. So just, kind of thinking out loud about that piece. And I think it opens up a conversation really around these, multiple damaging agents, what's responding to whom and what, and then how you can have interactions between pathogens and pests and bacteria. And, as we get a more refined look at what's happening with forests and plant health across California and in line with climate change, like how do we set ourselves up well to be able to answer some important questions around plant communities being triggered by same events? Maybe that's too deep of a thought for the afternoon, or not well enough thought through.
I mean, I'm not sure if Mateo is still on to hear the question, but I'm wondering if anybody else has thoughts about that.
And I raise it because I think it's easier to look at the multiple introduction model, perhaps, than the climatic response model. So there's kind of different ways to be trying to think about what we might be experiencing. If it's from the multiple introduction model, then it says that our quarantines aren't working that well and our detection is more limited. If it's responding to the climate, then that's saying there's a whole lot of other things happening and that there could have been a missed underlying situation for a long time. Each has sort of different impacts.
I have a question for Ariana, just trying to clarify your question, your musings, because I think it's really important. Is your question trying to just get at how do we look at a system and kind of assess what are the primary forces that are acting on it, or what are the key elements here that we should be honing in on, because there's so much going on and there's so many variables? Is that what I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question, because I think it is really important as somebody that tries to work on so many projects and help people out with doing just that, of figuring out the triage of what do we do here, what do we focus on, what are the problems.
Yeah, I think you're getting closer at it, Nikki. And Chris, I don't want to drive us down a rabbit hole if you've got other things you want to cover today, but I can see how all those signals that you could have synchrony in what Mateo's detecting in a smaller geographic area, but lumping that with Del Norte gets more complicated in my mind, just because the weather patterns are so significantly different between those two locations. So synchrony is really about, something happening in multiple locations in response to a single event. And I don't know that I could, in my mind, connect a single event that could be driving those conditions across Del Norte all the way to the Greater Bay Area. But I think a lot of the public is asking us to try and tie stuff to climatic conditions and climatic change. And so how do we set ourselves up well to begin to answer some of those questions over time and not react in a post facto and, sort of limited frame for analysis.
That's a very good point. While people are thinking, one thing that I'll note is that we did host the Oak Mortality Task Force was one of several parties to a tour that the Government Accountability Office conducted in both Southwestern Oregon and Northwestern California this year. And they were specifically tasked with looking at the potential interactions between climate change and agricultural pests. And they had 4 pests that they focused on throughout the country. And one of them was Phytophthora ramorum. And Wallace was part of that tour. Sarah, who is not in the meeting anymore, unfortunately, was part of that tour. Their report won't come out until sometime next year. But the question about climate change and how it interacts with these pesky critters is definitely on the radar of policymakers. And so I think that this question is definitely of interest and important. I don't have an answer for sure. Anybody else?
One thing. Chris,
Yeah.
Hi,
Ted.
Yeah, I guess the one thing that comes to mind for me is that it's not, clearly it's not completely driven by climate or whatever else, because you have to have the agent there to begin with, right? And so a lot of this is kind of sort of sampling error driven. Mateo already put forth there that they detected this in big time this year, but they hadn't previously, but he's sure that it goes back further. And so, one of that is just the rarity of the number of propagules and how they're distributed. It's whether you're going to detect it a lot. So I think one of the problems is things can creep under. I mean, sudden oak death was here a long time before it was recognized, just because it was kind of creeping under the radar for a long time and not really being sampled and whatnot. So there's, I think, a combination of things going on here that affects both the timing of which now there's enough sampling going on and enough genotyping going on that the chances of actually detecting it are greater than they were earlier. And again, as you get some areas, like if the Bay Area is becoming more and more infested and it's coming in through nurseries, outlying areas are going to more likely become hopscotch spread areas. So part of this can be straight epidemiology if you think about it. And it may have to do with the relative fitness or competition between these things, or what slight host differences and environmental differences that exist there. But I don't think you have to go right into this whole synchrony thing so much as thinking about sort of the progression of the spread of this genotype. And that's where the genotyping studies that Mateo was talking about doing would be interesting to see. Okay, has this been evolving? Has the NA2 strain, or is it completely clonal? Is it really evolving as it's going along? Can we see actual multiple subgenotypes in there that tell us that it's actually scooting around just like NA1 did? So I just throw that out that, the source of it really has to do with if there's some intangible or intangibles in terms of being able to sample for very rare things, and that ends up adding a lot of uncertainty in your starting points on things.
Got it, Ted. Thank you. Understood. That is that question of things being there to begin with, and you have to introduce the thing into the landscape in the first place, kind of bridges back to another outstanding question that we have in the chat. And so I'd like to take care of that before we leave today. And that question is for Kristen Fox. Kristen, are you still with us?
Yes.
Faith Campbell was wondering, why do you think that there have been many first-time positive nurseries recently, and is there anything to be done about that?
So a lot of those are trace forwards from the quarantine area. So like this year it involved 21 states and Canada. And Canada and Washington and Oregon were all within the quarantine area, but the rest were more on the East Coast. So it's just not as prevalent over there. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Does anybody else have anything to add to
Chris,
either of these questions? Yeah, go ahead, Faith.
Yeah, sorry. Kristen, do you mean these were nurseries found to be infected because they received infected plants from somebody else?
Yes.
Is that what you mean by trace forward? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, when we have a positive find in a nursery, we do both a trace back to the nursery they found it at, and we do a trace forward to everywhere they shipped host plants to.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Other thoughts or questions before I wrap it up? I wanted to just quickly say just a couple of things. I'm delighted to have all this participation and all these excellent speakers joining us today to give us this information. I think it underlines the fact that this pathogen is just going to keep throwing out surprises. In fact, this whole group of pathogens, Phytophthoras in general, just kind of keep throwing out surprises. And it'll probably keep happening in the future. And that's part of, I just wanted to bring it back around to this being the California Oak Mortality Task Force. You know, the group was founded partly to coordinate actions and activities in response to Phytophthora ramorum being out there and killing trees. We figured out in California pretty early on that it was very widespread, much more so than we thought. And so the ability and the capacity to react in a really widespread coordinated manner kind of frayed a little bit over the years, but the Oak Mortality Task Force has maintained an information and education and outreach capacity that we want to keep going in the future. And I think this meeting just shows that it's important for the Oak Mortality Task Force to keep doing that into the future. So one way that you can be connected to that is to check out the website, suddenOakDeath.org. We have quarterly newsletters that we post on that. And as far as I know, the recording, correct me if I'm wrong, Janice and Bonnie, but the recording of this meeting will be posted on that website.
Correct.
And is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and to that, just to that end, one last thing that I wanted to say, and then I'm done, is a big thank you to Susan Frankel, who has been the driving force, along with many helpers, behind our newsletter and behind the website for a long, long time. And Susan is fully retiring, and so this last issue of the newsletter is sort of her swan song. The newsletter will continue, but we will definitely miss Susan's input, her help, and everything that she's done. So big thank you to Susan, and I invite you all to tell her that personally when you see her. Hopefully she'll still be around and participating in our community and looking in to see what we're up to. If nobody else has anything, I mean, if anybody else has anything, now's the time. Otherwise, I will take this meeting and summarize it, present it to the California Forest Pest Council next month. Susan, do you have some words for us?
Just a reminder that tomorrow the Phytophthora and Native Habitats Work Group, or CalPhytos, is meeting at 1 o'clock, and everyone is welcome to join that. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thanks for that reminder. Thanks for that reminder. Hopefully we will see a bunch of you tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks, Janice and Bonnie.
Thanks, everyone.